Thank you very much. Good morning, opening panelists. Thank you for joining us here on stage. The way I will proceed now is that I'm going to introduce each one of you, and then I will kindly ask you to come here on stage and give your presentation. As we have said previously, please stick to your 9 minutes so that we can then afterwards also have a good discussion, and I will be the timekeeper if you allow. Okay, I would like to start with Joe Coleman, who is representing the Energy Markets Committee. Joe is a Director of Strategy at the UK Energy Technologies Institute, and as such, she is responsible for ETI's technology strategy, policy advice, and the development of insight publications. Prior, Joe worked in Shell for over 20 years in various technical and managerial roles around the world. Joe is a chartered mechanical engineer with a master's degree from the University of Oxford, and she holds an MBA in international management from the University of London. Joe, the energy industry is facing multiple challenges these days. On one hand, there's a growing demand in energy due to population rise and the growth of the middle class, and at the same time, we are faced with all the issues around climate change and lowering our carbon footprint. So we look very much forward to your deliberations on how the energy industry is set up to respond to these opportunities and challenges. Please, Joe, come.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Barbara. Actually, for a moment there, I thought you were going to give my talk. And since the abstract that I've got published is quite long, we've only got 9 minutes, you can almost follow along, because I don't think I can say much more than is in the abstract. But thank you very much for the introduction. I'm conscious that following on from MasterCard, the Energy Technologies Institute is probably not a company that you've heard of before. And in contrast, we are an organisation of around 60 people, so probably less than the size of the audience gathered here today. But I think size doesn't necessarily equate to the impact you can have, and we're all around having impact in the UK. So I'm going to say, let's start with a little bit about what is our company and what do we do, and then I'll go on to talk about the issues. So the Energy Technologies Institute is a public-private partnership, and we're a partnership between the UK government and major energy and engineering companies who have a presence in the UK. So not just UK companies, and to be frank, there aren't that many UK companies left in the industry, but basically global industries with a presence in the UK. And our mission is to support the UK in accelerating its transition towards a low-carbon economy. So my background is in oil and gas, it's in very big companies, but I now sit in the UK with a view of how can we accelerate that transition. And we do this in a number of ways. So we do this first and foremost by looking long and hard about transition pathways, about what are the routes to decarbonisation, not just about how can we reduce our emissions in the next 5 years, but actually how do we reach the really deep and challenging targets that we and others around the world expect us to meet. We then use this to drive innovation and innovation strategies, and then finally we invest in technologies typically that are in the valley of death. So they've come out of research funding, but they're not yet ready for scale up, or the markets aren't yet ready, or the markets aren't in place that would drive their scale up. So they're ahead of market, often ahead of consumer desire as well. So that's a little bit about the company. I'll come on now to talk about the challenges, and I think you can see from my title it's are we on track for too little, too late? The challenges we face as an Energy Markets Committee and as the industry as a whole, I think there's many challenges, as Barbara said, but they're challenges actually that we all need to tackle together. They're not challenges that the energy industry can tackle on its own. I think, to be frank, if we leave it to the energy industry, we will fail. And I don't think that's where we want to go. So I think it's upon us all as in the different businesses that we come from, the different committees discussing here today, it's on us all as consumers and as citizens to take a role in tackling these challenges. I've got no clue where I meant to point this at, but it appears to be doing something. So the challenges. So I think the first challenge we face is the inevitable growth in global demand for energy services. This doesn't necessarily mean we need more energy production, but it does mean we have a growing demand for energy services. The growth in global population, growth in global economy drives a demand for energy services. And it really isn't for us in the West, I think, to think that we should deny developing countries, developing populations with access to the same level of comfort and service that we experience. Now, it doesn't mean to say it needs to consume the same amount of energy, but that energy drives prosperity and energy drives bringing communities out of poverty. So I think this is a reality that we need to face. Now, growth in GDP doesn't necessarily equate directly to growth in energy, and I'm using here, you probably can't see the underlying font, but I'm using here BP's Energy Outlook. And they're showing just over a 30% growth in energy demand by 2035, in contrast to 100% growth in global GDP. So, you know, we can drive a disconnect in terms of energy growth and its relationship with GDP, but that's still a significant increase in energy demand. Now, that's a challenge that I actually think the energy industry is up to. We don't have a global shortage of sources of energy. In fact, we're growing new sources of energy every day. But the second challenge is much bigger, and the second challenge is climate change. And, you know, I think the evidence now that our consumption of fossil fuels is the primary driver of climate change is overwhelming. And therefore, what the energy industry does, but also what we do as consumers, is really at the heart of the challenge of climate change. This chart shows you what if you like, sorry, I didn't mean to go forwards there. What the global, if you like, what the pledges made by all governments at during the Paris discussions last year add up to. And the sort of the green and the yellow lines or wedges at the bottom show what is required to get us onto a 2 degree, let alone a 1.5 degree pathway. And the pledges made, in contrast to the current policies in place, or the red bit that's sort of in the middle of the chart. And I think what this shows you is that the pledges that governments have made, whilst they're good and whilst they're a good step forward, are absolutely not putting us on a path to deliver a 2 degrees world, let alone 1.5. So the question I have today is what can we do about that? I don't think we can leave it to governments to solve on their own. So climate change calls for a major transition of our energy systems, be they national, regional, global, towards renewables and low carbon technologies. And I think it's important that we take a whole systems approach to this. We tend to focus on electricity, but electricity is only part of the problem and part of the solution. And I'm using a UK chart here, and for those who can't see it, and for just focus on the right-hand side, that pie chart, the green bit there, which is probably a little under 15% of UK energy consumption, is what we consume in electricity. The rest is consumed as heat and as transport. So this isn't about renewable electricities as being the only part of the solution. There's a lot more to this. And so we need to take a whole systems approach to saying how do we transition the whole energy system. Of course, this chart will be different in different countries. Your chart will look, every country's will look different. We consume a huge amount of energy in heat. In other countries it will be in cooling. But heat is also a major part of our industrial consumption of energy, and we all have that. So when we think about this challenge, and I think possibly in contrast or sort of I will contrast it with the digital world. Energy infrastructure and the time frame for its renewal are long, and energy assets stay in place for even longer. So stuff that we build today, we can expect to be around in 2050 and beyond. So if you invest in a coal plant today, that coal plant will be generating emissions for 40, 50, possibly even longer years to come. And I'm sure you're all aware it's an awful lot more difficult, having built something, having invested in it, to decide further down the line to stop using that asset. It's actually a lot easier not to build that asset in the first place, or to build something lower carbon in the first place. And even if we come back further close to home, you know, we think about the car, and we see Tesla as one of the companies that can change the world. But if you look at the rate of change in terms of the cars we buy, and you look at the time frame between when we'll hit the 2 degrees impact on climate, some of us will only buy or will only own one more car in that time frame. So the question is, what are we doing about that? What are we individually doing about that difference? And we can't all buy a Tesla tomorrow. Tesla can't possibly make that level of cars. And our energy infrastructure isn't set up to deal with it yet. But this is a big challenge that we face. How do we transition our infrastructure? And how do we build infrastructure in advance of need as well? And of course, that's got risk associated with it. And it's, you know, it's a bit like we could argue it's a bit like the VHS Beta decision, or we were talking about the MasterCard Visa decision there. You know, will we ultimately end up with hydrogen-fueled vehicles, or will we end up with electric-fueled vehicles? How do we make the decisions to invest in infrastructure ahead of need? I think that when we think about the technology that will be part of this solution, I find it, and I'm an engineer, I find it hard to imagine that we can invent new technologies today that will be able to basically go through R&D, go through development, deployment, and actually have a material impact as genuinely new technologies on our infrastructure in the time frame that counts. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean to say I don't think there'll be huge disruption in the industry, and I'm also very open to bringing in silver bullets. But I think we shouldn't build a strategy to tackle the biggest challenge I think that the world has faced in our living time frame by relying on silver bullets. And I think in the energy industry there's a temptation to believe that something just over the horizon, or something that's not quite yet developed, or something that we're going to invent in the future will be the solution, when actually we have enough solutions available to us today to get on with the challenge. So we should bring in those silver bullets when they come about, if they come about, but we shouldn't halt progress today, or hold back on progress to wait for them. I don't want to use that one, so I'm going to go on to my conclusions. So the challenges I think I see are, how are the incumbent industries going to respond to this? How is the energy industry going to respond to these challenges? How are we also in that going to respond to the challenges of consumers? Consumers are changing, and that is very much driven by the digital world and digital technology. I'm going to just refer to my notes on what did Michael refer to as what consumers want. Access, convenience and security. Those things apply equally to the energy industry. But what consumers also want is control and transparency. They want a lot of things, and the digital world and IT can very much help to give them that. And that, of course, changes things for the incumbents, and it provides opportunities for new business models, and it provides opportunities for disruption. And I think many of the current energy players may well end up being Kodaks, and we may well see new companies come in. But scale also counts in the energy industry, and small retail companies are not going to build the infrastructure that we need in the future to make the transition happen. So the questions I have, and questions I have for the Energy Committee, but more broadly to all of you, is around what is the balance of responsibility that we should play out between our companies, between business and between governments? is this a job for governments? Is this a job for those people who are going to meet at COP22 and COP23 and COP24? Or is it us, businesses, that drive the change? What can we all do in our businesses, both in our to reduce our own emissions, but what can we also do to influence our consumers, our customers, and society around us to make the necessary changes? What can we do to influence our governments to make those changes? How do we influence the regulators that we work in? This is not just about energy regulator in the traditional sense. This is about the regulators of transport, of shipping, of aviation, of other users of energy. How do we leverage the co-benefits of tackling climate change? Tackling climate change is often seen as a cost. Paying for low carbon is seen as more expensive, but the co-benefits are enormous. And yet most governments are not in a position, most governments are really bad at joining up, for example, the benefits that reducing emissions would have on health with the cost associated with potentially taking cars out of inner cities. Jobs. We have a committee here on creating jobs. The energy industry and low carbon can generate a huge amount of jobs. Reducing poverty. Energy is a route out of poverty for many around the developing world. Land use as well is an incredibly important debate. I'm going to be followed by a talk on agriculture, and I think the food versus fuel debate is also an enormously important one. These are some of the challenges I think I would like to see the various committees discussing today, on top of your own challenges. So I set you additional challenges. But to conclude, I think the technology solutions that we need to face this challenge, they're with us today. It's simply a matter of having the will to make them happen, and not just having the will, but taking the collective action to make them happen. Thank you.